Schönen guten Abend. Und der Krieg, Spasiba, Kirill Rogow, vielen Dank Erich Klein. Es ist mir eine große Freude, it's a great pleasure now to announce the second speech of this evening, of this opening evening. Es ist mir eine große Freude, Alexander Etkind hier zu haben. Alexander Etkind, 1955 in St. Petersburg, damals Leningrad, geboren, ist russischer Psychologe, Kulturwissenschaftler und Journalist. Er lehrte an Universitäten in St. Petersburg, Cambridge und Florenz. Seine Forschungsschwerpunkte die Kolonisation Russlands, russische Protestbewegungen sowie Erinnerungskulturen in Osteuropa. Derzeit unterrichtet er hier in Wien an der Central European University. Die erste große Publikation, damals waren Sie hier auch in Wien, erinnere ich mich, am Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, die Geschichte der Psychoanalyse in Russland, Eros des Unmöglichen, ein wunderbarer Titel. Andere Publikationen, Natural's Evil, A Cultural History of Natural Resources und das letzte, ganz neu, Russia Against Modernity. May I kindly ask you on the floor, please heartfully welcome Alexander Etkind.
Добрый вечер.
Добрый вечер. Спасибо.
Думали, что вы уже пропали.
Нет, я тут. Я живу рядом, так что я совсем. Okay, so you will ask me questions? Or
Yeah, I will ask you
okay.
a few questions, but I will start with some quotation from the Frankfurter Allgemeine about, we are talking a little bit about the book which is called Russia Against Modernity. It was published in 23, yeah, this year. And it's some kind of polemic big essay, some kind of distillate concentration of your former books about, on one side, the internal colonization of Russia, about different questions about energy, and even more, I would suppose. And there is a quite good journalistic touch in this book as well. Die FAZ schreibt über das Buch, you've read it, irgendwann heuer im Sommer. Wie konnte es dazu kommen, dass Russland mit seiner gut ausgebildeten Bevölkerung und seinen reichen Rohstoffvorkommen heute so arm und unfrei ist? Etkind erblickt den Ursprung allen Übels im russischen Staat, der von einer Pseudo-Elite gekapert worden sei. Dieses Machtkartell besteht heute hauptsächlich aus 70-Jährigen, die noch vom sowjetischen Wirtschaftshabitus der schnellen Ausbeutung endlicher Ressourcen geprägt sind. Moderne Konzepte wie ökologische Nachhaltigkeit, soziale Gerechtigkeit oder internationale Kooperation sind diesem eingeschworenen Zirkel fremd. Russland setzt fast ausschließlich auf fossile und nukleare Brennstoffe. Bereits 2010 hatte sich Putin über die westliche Energiepolitik lustig gemacht und maliziös darauf hingewiesen, dass die Abhängigkeit von Russland in jedem Fall bestehen bleibe. Let's start with a very practical question. We have, I suppose, no Russian gas for heating in here. It's quite warm. We have no contract with Gazprom. Anyway, in one part of your book, you are nearly joking, mocking about the German love affair with Russia. It's not the main topic. You were quite critical about this situation with gas and oil many years ago. What do you think about Austria in this context, living, teaching in this country? And you hear it from time to time. A few weeks ago we learned it's still 80% of Russian gas we receive in Austria.
Right. Austria is a hub for the Russian gas. And it used to be, and actually that's an interesting history, because the major pipeline that goes through Austria was opened in 1968, few days after the invasion of the Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia. 11 days after that. So the world press was talking mostly about the Soviet troops and whatever happened between the Russian tanks and the Czech youth on the streets of Prague. But in Austria, they were preparing for the kind of big ceremonial opening of the gas hub. And it is still working, distributing gas, say, to Hungary, but also a big part of it is burned here. And it looks like nothing would stop it. But we'll see. I actually think that things are changing.
Children in Austria even knew, because of this, they even knew the word Družba, because of this gas pipeline was called Družba.
Okay.
I made some kind of research, some kind of journalistic research a year ago about the origin of these Russian gas pipelines. When Germans in the late 1950s, the early 1960s, wanted to get in contact with this cheap, at that time already quite cheap, Russian gas, with this very important resource in the Soviet Union, Americans at that time already tried to criticize. They said the same thing they say now, and obviously they were right about this great problem to be not independent from Russia or the Soviet Union at that time. Anyway, in the 1970s, they opened these gas pipelines. I remember right before, in autumn, before the Great War in Ukraine now started, and we already had all these discussions about Nord Stream. One former Austrian Prime Minister, Branitzky, in an interview said, "We should not allow Americans to decide our basic economic problems." He wouldn't say this again after the war started. But wasn't he somehow right at the time? Where is the big moralistic implication of this question?
Well, that depends on what you believe is the Austrian national interest. Is it in the national interest of Austria, or say, was it in this interest to see the Russian troops in Prague in 1968? I guess no, like all these traditions, whatever, of Austrian sovereignty, of these imperial legacies and the cultural affinities and everything testifies against this. And of course it's not in Austrian national interest to have war in Ukraine right now. But there is also economics, there are finances, there is stability of the supplies. What's going on? Why the Russian gas is cheap? There are many reasons for that, but one reason is that the contracts with Gazprom are very long term. Some of these contracts were signed 25 or maybe 30 years ago. And the prices were fixed, say, 25 years ago. Imagine you're buying a bread or a cup of coffee. Now in Vienna, by the price of whatever, 1990, that would be very cheap cup of coffee or bottle of whiskey. So that's the issue. At some point, the European Union, which of course is trying to introduce whatever fair competition and whatever civilized business around Europe, so forbade to sign contracts for the duration of more than 25 years. But they are still, before 2022, contracts were still signed for 25, not for 30 years anymore, but for 25 years they were allowed. Still, there was a political will, say in Germany and in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia, in the Czech Republic, and in many other countries, member states of the European Union, to stop these contracts and to get rid of the Russian gas. Almost everywhere it happened, but in Austria and in Hungary. And why so? That's that's rather a question to you than to me.
It's still 25 years or so. The book is obviously connected with the war in Ukraine. Why is this the main title, Russia Against Modernity? Why is this connected? And you talk a lot about this with the war against Ukraine. If you can explain it a little bit, because it's two different parts of one game in your book.
Well, this book was written actually during the war. I mean, during this last stage of the war that started in February 2022. So the war started. I had entirely different scholarly project at that moment, but I just felt that I have to, write about what I was then truly interested in. And so I wrote this book like in a few months, and then it was published in a few months. So it's a wartime book. And there is some passion there, whatever you say, it's polemical, it is polemical. But still, I was trying to find a kind of a scholarly concept that embraces the whole panoply of these issues. And there are very, very different issues. The economic, once again, and the cultural, and the political. And also the ecological, and the ecology and the environment and the climate is also a big part of this book. So embracing all that in one concept was difficult, but so my solution was to analyze this the current moment as the advent of the new kind of modernity. Modernity is an old thing. People have been talking about modernity for centuries now. Everything that is new was called modern. But clearly we are now living in a very particular kind of, in a major turn of events. And that's mostly connected to the climate crisis or other catastrophe, as it is politically correct to put it today. And I really believe that major wars of the current moment, both in Eastern Europe and in Near East, are connected, like historically, genealogically, I would say, connected to the climate crisis. Because who is the most vulnerable? Which type of country is the most vulnerable to the green transition, decarbonization? That's those countries that have the existential interest in drilling fossil fuel, in trading this fossil fuel, and have not much else to offer for the survival of their state institutions. So this type of countries, this type of states is called petro-state. And the petro-state is the major culprit of the events. Russia, of course, is the exemplary petro-state, but also in the events of the Near East, there are we know that there was some financing and armaments coming from Qatar and Iran, and they are both petro-states as well. And so these countries, people are saying that these are the poor population of the global south who are the most vulnerable, but in fact it is the global north that experiences climate change 3 times more intensively than global south, just in the Arctic parts that suffer way too much. There is not much of population there, but this connection to the oil curse, to the petrostate, to the oil and gas trade on the global scale is strangely missing in the global debate. So I was trying to, so the whole book basically is an attempt to reintroduce these concepts into the understanding of the current moment.
When reading your book, a strange other story came to my mind. Somewhere in, I suppose, in 1987 or so, there, no, probably 86 anyway, there was a meeting in Kyrgyzstan at Issyk. Gorbachev invited international intellectuals. One of them was the, at that time, quite new Nobel Prize winner, the French Claude Simon, who wrote a very polemic essay which was called The Invitation or so. And the point of discussion there was climate change. At that time, it was not atmosphere, it was a future in ice and snow or so, I remember somehow. So the opposite we have now. And Claude Simon, sure, he was interested simply to go to Kyrgyzstan. It was February or March, and he only describes how he's sitting there watching the landscape and it's snowing. And it's a very beautiful picture of the place around Issyk. Why I remember this is Gorbachev wanted something like an international contract or some ideas. Obviously at that time, when in Russian or Soviet politics, these international topics were modern and people were interested to show how modern they are. And only Claude Simon said, well, it's so boring, because he had the idea that all this talk about climate change was just undermining the real problems of this state. And finally he was right. It was just a romantic decoration, the talks about climate change. Anyway, we know it was no climate change. When you go back a little bit, why, from your point of view, did this happen, that these ecological problems, I'm not talking about the ecological problems during the war in Ukraine right now, because there will be a lot of investigations and people are already collecting material about whatever. Why couldn't this become in Russia a main topic? Al Gore could. Why Russians could not make it an important topic? I'm sorry about this kind of naive question.
Well, Al Gore
because
could, but
you're smiling.
No, I love Al Gore, and he could, but he failed elections by a few, whatever, hundreds or thousands of votes, and of course the world would be different now.
That's why I'm asking this. If
it happened otherwise, then Russia was aware of climate change from the start. What was the start? That was, interestingly enough, that was also the year 1968, when international intellectuals established the Club of Rome, which was like a club of celebrities and intellectuals, and they warned about climate change, about the limits of growth, about the explosion of population, and many such things. And a Russian representative, his name was Gvishani, and he happened to be the son-in-law of the Soviet Prime Minister at the moment.
He was sitting in Luxembourg sometime, I suppose.
Yeah, he was. That was later. But he was a founding member of the Club of Rome, so he took part in all this meetings and volumes. But Russia had to take a serious part in all these agreements and treatments. At some point, there was a genuine interest on the part of Russian climatologists, and also, I would say, some economists pretty close to the high quarters to the Kremlin. So there was this idea that because of the emission trading schemes, that's a little bit too technical to explain right now, but there is this trade of emissions that is going on now within the European Union and separately in China and separately in California. So those parts or those states in Europe that emit more than others, they pay to those others. Say Germany is paying to Poland or to Latvia every year. It's very serious money, billions of euros, as compensating for the emissions. So if Russia, by some kind of whim of history, or rather by political will of the Russian leadership, would be included or admitted to these trading schemes, then because of the huge territory of Russia, all those forests and marshes and wasteland or agricultural fields, everything, like every acre would be earning money from places like Germany or Austria, just for the fact that it was not emitting, because there is no population there, no industry, whatever. No coal or oil would be burnt on this acre. And that actually could potentially resolve many problems. At least that could sort of decrease significantly Russia's dependence on the export of those very fossil fuels. So there were calculations, there were debates, and there was also lots of denial. I call it climate denialism and resistance and whatever, sabotage, I would say, of these projects. And of course, they went nowhere. And in the current, speaking now, of course, it's very clear why it could not go anywhere. But then people did believe in that, and that was pretty honest and intensive debate. And when I'm talking about them, that was like before 2014, even after 2014, these debates continued, because 2014, horrible as it was not such a watershed as 2022.
I was asking about this because, as far as I know, discussions in the Russian public sphere, they are not for a long time, well, in Moscow or in big cities, they were not quite different to discussions wherever in Europe, wherever in the United States. There were these talks about new ethics and so on and so on. And the same point about these ecological topics. How could these topics come back, if they come back at any time in the future?
I agree with you that
what
the
would be the condition? I only wanted to say Russia is not so different as people sometimes say.
It's difficult to say. Russia, I think, is different. And, at this moment, it's difficult to say it's not different. But it's also true that the public sphere in Russia, say in the years like 2000, whatever, 2000s, like up to 2014, was relatively civilized. There was not much of censorship, there was like, you know, different people have their different views freely expressed. There was a lot of cynicism. I think there was more of cynicism and kind of dark humor and what is called
then in Russian, the West?
Stёb. Done in the West, there was, yeah, there was.
We are boring, simply.
I would say that, yeah, because yellow press is yellow press everywhere, also in Russia or whatever. But in the mainstream newspapers, I think there was more of what is in Russian called stёb, and the Russians were trying to translate it for the foreigners as postmodernism, which would... and that was, you know, pretty typical. The point was that this kind of free debate, in fact, it was limited, but a relatively free debate really was disconnected from any political reality, from any reality of decision making. So while these fancy and glossy outlets were debating all kinds of postmodernist issues, you know, people in the Kremlin or, you know, in other high offices, they basically were preparing for the full-scale war. And they were very well sort of trained, those people in high offices. They were real masters of conspiracy, of secrecy. This is what, they're not so good at war as we see it now, but they were very good at keeping their preparations secret. And that's why they surprised us so much. And also that's why the political debate in the glossy outlets was entirely disconnected from the actual policies on the ground.
The Kremlin is some kind of Hamas gang preparing for some kind of terrible things and being so convinced of themselves that no one learned about these plans.
Yeah, they are good at it. We should, you know, give them this credit, at least this one.
Probably I will ask for some copyright about the comparison between Hamas and the Kremlin. I was asking about the difference of Russia and the West, because you have a very important chapter about so-called normalization, a topic Western sociologists, politologues, in a moment try to describe this other post-Soviet society with the term of normalization. I once made something for the radio about Russian elites, and I talked to Gleb Pavlovsky, and he said, there are no elites, we have just chinovniki. Can you explain this problem with elites a little bit? Because it's not elites, these guys like Deripaska and Abramovich and whoever you mention you find in yellow press, and when you see some quite beautiful exposition with very good pictures, one already forgets that it might come from the collection of Abramovich, and then it's just good art, yeah? What's the problem with this elite in the post-Soviet society?
Well, first about Hamas and the Kremlin, I agree with you that there is a deep analogy. And actually, I wrote about it as well, so I will claim a part of your copyright. And there are also differences, but clearly, say difference in scale of action. But similarities are deep, and one similarity is, you know, both are sort of, you know, highly militarized, highly secretive corporations, whatever, institutions that have or used to have, in the case of Hamas, full power over the land and the people. And also they are, and that's, I think, the most sort of questionable point, but I believe in that, they are culturally, they are equally distant culturally from the people themselves, from the peoples themselves. They're entirely different. The leaders of the Hamas, the leaders of the Kremlin, are entirely different. It's an ocean of difference, two oceans of differences between these militarized institutions and the peoples of those lands. And another similarity is that quite artificially, and that really clearly fits their interests, quite artificially, the Hamas and the Kremlin kept the subordinate population in poverty. They had lots of money coming, in both cases, you know, in the final account from oil and gas, but you know, we know these routes very well. And like their kind of mission was to distribute these funds among the populations, but of course they did entirely different things. They used those funds, huge funds, for you know, buying arms or digging tunnels or you know, creating nuclear missiles.
Or building residential dachas on many places in Russia.
Yeah, and so why is it good for them to keep the population in poverty? Well, first they have money. Such institutions need lots of money for their very expensive toys. And second, having very poor population is pretty convenient, pretty good for having a standing army, or even for having well-paid volunteers when they are needed, because that, as we see it in Russia, is pretty cheap by international standards. So this comparison, I think, shows the actual character of the so-called Russian elite. I know this is a very popular term among the political scientists, but I always use this concept of elite in quotation marks, you know, because, you know, they're not elite. They're not, I mean, their education is not elite, their whatever morale is not elite, their health is not elite, whatever, but they have lots and lots of embezzled money. Does this make them elite? Like does this unquote these quotation marks? That's obviously depends on.
As far as I understand, a game Russian intellectuals very much like to play is to accuse each other who at what time worked with the Kremlin or with some institutions connected with the Kremlin. 15 years ago or 5 years ago, or becoming the editor of a very prestigious opposite newspaper, and then you find terrible or horrible quotations. You know whom I'm talking about. You left Russia many years ago. There are a few people in here who probably still remember your uncle, who, Etkind, who was in Vienna many times because of the director of this literature institution liked him very much. I saw him 2 or 3 times even.
Of this
not of this one, unfortunately, but it was Gesellschaft für Literatur. And at that time it was still a great event, and he came. I'm talking about Etkind, the philologist and translator. He several times came back from Paris when he was there. So, what about this decision? We first time met quite at the very beginning of your immigration, and I suppose it even was not an immigration at that time. You just worked in another country, right?
Well, I until very recently, until basically the current war, I didn't feel myself as an emigre, as a refugee. Now I do. Now I feel. But I left in the 90s, and I was coming back and forth, and you know, so that was basically trivial. And of course, you know, I was more like a gastarbeiter. You know, I taught at Cambridge or other, you know, fancy places because they paid, you know, better than I would have had in Petersburg. Though life in Petersburg was also nice, so I was getting back very often. But yes, but now I feel myself as a political refugee. I don't go back. I don't want to go back. I'm not that I'm. Perhaps I should be afraid of going back. I'm not afraid, but I just do not go back. And that constitutes, I think, a political emigration.
If I may ask you still keep a Russian passport?
Yeah.
If you don't answer it, don't worry.
No. Okay, I don't answer. Okay. That's an increasingly complex situation on both sides, on all sides, you know. Getting rid of this passport is also complex. Okay, go on.
Mm-hmm. Probably you want to ask something. That's what I wanted to say.
Muss ich auf die Bühne? Gibt es Ihrerseits im Publikum hier Fragen an die Vortragenden? Are there some questions? Oder an Erich Klein? Dann bitte ich um Ihr Zeichen. Ich sehe kein Zeichen. Ja, ich sehe ein Zeichen. Darf ich Sie bitten, ins Mikrofon zu sprechen? Moment bitte.
Einen Moment, meine Frage betrifft noch, was ist mit den Leuten oben? Haben die auch die Möglichkeit?
Die Leute leider, das ist technisch, wir können nicht beides. Wir sind ein bisschen limitiert in diesen Räumlichkeiten mit der Technik. Wir tun unser Bestes. Ja, ganz hinten, aber ich muss bitten ums Mikrofon. Kann jemand, weil sonst versteht man die Frage im Stream nicht.
Thank you very much, Professor Etkind. I appreciate your analysis of the Russian war against modernity in terms of its trappedness in an economy, in a petrol economy. You've made the comparison between Hamas and the Kremlin. The Near East population is a young and dynamic population. The Russian population is collapsing. Could you discuss the Russian war against modernity in terms of the population structure of Russia?
Yeah, there is a chapter in this book, chapter number number 6, exactly about demographic and also gender issues of the Russian population. And they are really exciting, I think, at this point. Because if you look at the charts, just a timeline, like fertility charts, they're called technically, just how many people are born in Russia, like every year. These charts have ups and downs, and these ups and downs exactly match the political turns in Russia. So after 1991, there was a really big down. Then it was like, in the better decade, it's called fat years, like from 2004 to 2014, the fat decade. So the population was kind of growing somehow. And then exactly after 2014, the birth rate is going very seriously down. It was very low, but it's going down, down, down. And after 2022, it's collapsing. So it's interesting because, you know, people, if to ask some kind of sociological questions, like sociologists love to ask, like, are you happy? Are you satisfied? Are you content? And so this chart would be kind of less meaningful than the chart of birth rate. As if, and I actually believe it is true, people, statistically, all these masses of people, all these millions, of men and women, they really make their decisions whether to conceive or to make an abortion or abstain, etc., according to the political conditions in the country. And I do believe that, like in an undemocratic or authoritarian country like Russia, birth rate reflects the political mood of the population better than sociological polls. There is much more to say about that, but I hope that you will read chapter 6.
Wir haben eine zweite Frage im Publikum.
Thank you very much. The now German, but originally Russian writer, wife of Karl Schlögel, Sonja Margolina, wrote 3-4 weeks ago about the high number of members from minority groups in the war, in the army, and she thinks that there is a purpose behind it, even. She is suspicious that Putin and his cronies may even wish that proportionally many more of these men die in the war than the Russians, and they are drafted more frequently or more often, and or they are bought because they come from very poor. You spoke about poverty in Russia. These are the very poor areas in Siberia. I lived in Siberia, so I know it a little bit myself. And this would be very cynical if they really calculate with many more men from these minority groups. Yes, Estonia, I don't know, that is more Caucasus, but also from the Asian part of Russia. Could this be possible in your view?
Well, there are facts and there are interpretations. So the fact is, and that fact was noted first, I think, by the BBC Russian service, I think, to female journalists working in London. They actually calculated the they found a way to calculate the number of recruits from different administrative regions of Russia, and they found out that the farther you go from Moscow, the more this region is represented in the acting army, and places like Buryatia, etc., they are way overrepresented, while Moscow and Petersburg, that have a really big part of the Russian population. There was at that point like few percent in the Russian army. But there are interpretations. So Sonja Margolina thinks that this is done, as you say, precisely for killing the ethnic minorities. That's a strong interpretation, I would say. But there are other kind of, more believable ones. For instance, people are way poorer in Siberia or whatever elsewhere in the Caucasus, places like Dagestan, than in Moscow, Petersburg, and they are more eager to sign these contracts, basically to sell their lives for these high salaries, or whatever would be paid for to their widows. There are other interpretations, like of course the whole story of this mobilization is about escaping the protest. Like while waging the war, the Kremlin wants to escape protests and revolution in Russia. And revolutions happen in the capitals. They don't happen in the distant provinces. They happen in the capitals. So when and if they will start conscripting from Moscow in significant numbers, that will probably cause a significant protest, and this protest could easily be violent, because it is about life and death, and people will respond to that. But if this protest is taking place in a very distant land, like, say, Dagestan, or Khabarovsk, okay, so there could be, this protest could go for months and months, could be violent, but it's very, very far from a revolution.
Probably this will be a point of our tomorrow's discussion, the protest in Dagestan, and your point of view, and as I understand, your somehow different point of view in this case. When I ask you, a last thing I would like to ask you, when I ask you about living in the West, what about this somehow strange phenomenon about our propaganda? The war started, I mean, last year, and there was not a general picture because there is no general plan. And I'm not paranoid, not on Putin's side, but there was this very obvious conviction that Ukraine will win the war. If you look at TV programs, Austrian, Germans, or read articles, you still will find this kind of subcutaneous, I call it propaganda, it's not a big problem. The conviction Ukraine will win the war. Then you, step by step, alluding this conviction. There were, on Austrian TV, you have some Austrian analysts from the Austrian army. They are not so bad as our army is small. And they, more than half a year ago said, well, don't be so convinced about the Ukrainian victory in this. Well, it's not just a game, it's a real war. What do you think about this development, if I describe it in the right way, and if you see what I mean? The loss of the conviction that we are fighting on the right side, let's put it this way.
Well, you can fight on the right side, but still lose. that also happens, unfortunately, But the story had, many stages. Before the war started in February 22, so most analysts were sure that the Russian army is will overwhelm immediately, it's a couple of weeks, and the Kiev will be taken. Basically, the fancy analysts, pundits in New York or Washington or Vienna or Berlin, definitely, they agreed with Putin that it would take two weeks, and that's it. But then Ukraine made some successes, and they were very impressive, and the opinion changed. But this war has two aspects: military aspect and economic aspect. And these aspects, they worked, they had different rhythms. That was like a kind of very disorganized movements. And I think that on the military side, the military aid was largely, to Ukraine, was largely successful. While the economic warfare, all these fabulous sanctions that were promised with full certainty, and everyone, of course, if professionals, whatever from the World Bank or from the Federal Reserve, when they say something that it will happen, and it is really under their competence, of course we believe that it would happen, but it has not happened. This economic warfare has been lost already. It doesn't mean that could be some kind of magic, change and recovery. But at this point, that's true. And of course, if Russia is still selling its oil, not exactly whatever to Germany, but to China and India, and the European Union has, could stop this trade any time, any day, because this trade goes through the Danish Straits. So if the economic warfare is lost, it's difficult to expect that the military successes of Ukraine will go far.
Russlands Zukunft und der Krieg, Kirill Rogows Essay, Einleitungsvortrag, liegt hier auf in russischer und englischer Sprache und ist ab Montag auch über unsere Homepage abrufbar, alte-oder-schmiede.at. Russia Against Modernity, Alexander Etkind, oben am Büchertisch. Morgen geht es hier im Haus um 16 Uhr weiter mit Daria Serenko, Mädchen und Institutionen, Geschichten aus dem Totalitarismus. Ich muss darf zwei Programmänderungen ansagen. Um 16.45 Uhr wird Philipp Zertko, Zertko, bitte um Entschuldigung, falsch geschrieben da. Philipp Zertko, vielen Dank, Erich. Ist immer gut, wenn man jemanden hat, der Russisch kann. Philipp Zertko wird Radio Martin, den Beginn eines Romans vorstellen, und Anna Narinskaya wird einen Film zeigen um 17.30 Uhr, einen ersten Film, ein zweiter kommt dann in der Matinee am Sonntag, nämlich der 5. Punkt über die russischen Juden. Jetzt darf ich Ihnen noch ansagen, bleiben Sie hier.
Auch hier eine kleine, Entschuldige, das habe ich dir falsch weitergegeben, über die sowjetischen Juden.
Über die sowjetischen Juden. Insofern war es diesmal nicht mein Fehler. Danke für die Korrektur. Ich darf Ihnen jetzt noch sagen, bleiben Sie hier, wenn Sie wollen. Es gibt oben einen großen Büchertisch, da finden Sie die Bücher aller unserer Autorengäste. Und sensationell und ausnahmsweise ab 21 Uhr in der Werkstatt Aljoscha Bis und Alexander Swevchenko. Swevchenko, danke. Das nächste Mal lasse ich den Chef moderieren. Der kennt sie schon länger als ich. Zwei exzellente Musiker, die schon lange, russische Musiker, schon lange in Wien sind, auf eine gewisse Weise verwienert, aber immer noch sehr russisch. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Vielen Dank, Kirill Rogow, Alexander Etkind und Erich Klein. Und ich hoffe, Sie sind morgen wieder bei uns. Spasiba. Thank you.
Morgen wird es weitaus literarischer, wenn man das so sagen will.